Introduction to the story of Ishmael. Did you know that Ishmael was Abraham's first son, but he was born in a very different way than we might imagine? Well, Ishmael's mother was Hagar, an Egyptian servant who worked for Sarah, Abraham's wife. And do you know why this happened? Because God had promised Abraham something incredible, that he would have a family so large that it would be impossible to count, like the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the beach. But there was a problem. Sarah couldn't have children, and Abraham was already very old. But before that, check if you've already subscribed, like and share the video. Let's go. Back then, when a woman couldn't have children, it was common for her to allow her servant to have a baby in her place. That's exactly what Sarah did. She suggested that Hagar have a child with Abraham, and that's how Ishmael was born. It seems like a different solution, right? But it was something normal back then. Now, the story starts to get interesting. Just imagine, a baby who was born because of a great promise from God, but who also brought many challenges to the family. Ishmael was not just any baby. He was Abraham's first son, and therefore, he had a very important role. However, this story is not just about Ishmael. It is about how God fulfills his promises, even when it seems impossible, and how he takes care of every detail, even in difficult times. If you are curious to know more about Ishmael, get ready. Let's discover together everything the Bible tells us about him, his mother Hagar, and what happened in this family full of remarkable stories. You won't want to miss a thing. The birth of Ishmael. Just imagine. Abraham was already 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Can you believe it? He was already an elderly man, but he was super excited about the birth of his first son. Ishmael was the baby that Abraham had been waiting for, and he loved the boy very much. So much so that Abraham asked God, "Lord, may Ishmael be the heir that you promised me." After all, he thought that Ishmael was the answer to God's promise. But do you know what happened? When Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him with even more surprising news. Abraham, your wife Sarah, who is old and cannot have children, is going to have a baby. He will be the heir that I promised. Can you imagine Abraham's reaction? He must have been shocked, but also very excited. This baby would be Isaac, the legitimate son of Abraham and Sarah. In the meantime, God also did something very important. He established a covenant with Abraham and his family, asking that all males be circumcised as a sign of this commitment. At that time, Ishmael was 13 years old and was circumcised along with his father. In fact, this practice of circumcising adolescents at this age was adopted by some Arab tribes and continues to this day. Then, about a year later, the seemingly impossible happened. Sarah, who was already an elderly lady and had never been able to get pregnant, gave birth to Isaac. This birth brought great joy to Abraham and Sarah, but it also began to cause some problems between the two families. Ishmael, who was the first son, suddenly found all the attention focused on the new baby. And this, as we will see, ended up creating some tension within Abraham's household. Ishmael grew up to be a strong boy and loved by his father, but his story was just beginning. He had a very special role in God's plan, and even though he was not the heir of the promise, God still had big plans for him. This story is full of twists and turns, isn't it? And the best part is that all of this teaches us how God always keeps his promises, even when it seems hard to believe. The conflicts between Sarah and Hagar. Now imagine this situation. Sarah and Hagar, two women living in the same house, but with a relationship that began to get very complicated. When Hagar discovered that she was pregnant with Abraham, she began to feel superior to Sarah. After all, Sarah was barren and could not have children. Hagar must have thought, "I managed to give Abraham the son that Sarah never could." This caused a lot of problems because, at that time, a slave could never disrespect her mistress, even if she had something that she did not have. Sarah, of course, was very hurt and angry with Hagar's attitude. According to the laws of that time, Sarah had the right to reprimand Hagar and even treat her harshly because of her contempt. The situation became so unbearable that Hagar decided to run away. Just imagine, a pregnant woman alone walking through the desert aimlessly without help. It must have been scary and very difficult for her. But it was in the middle of the desert, in that moment of despair, that something wonderful happened. An angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar. He not only comforted her, but also brought a very special message. The angel told Hagar to return to the house of Abraham and Sarah and promised that the son she was expecting would be very important. He would be called Ishmael, which means God hears, because God heard Hagar's cries and distress at that moment. This visit from the angel showed Hagar that, even in the midst of problems and conflicts, God was taking care of her and her son. He did not leave her alone in the desert, but gave her strength and courage to continue her journey. This story teaches us that, even when things seem out of control, God is attentive and ready to help us, as he did with Hagar. The expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Now imagine the following. Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham, was growing up, and the day came for him to be weaned, which was a very important moment in the culture of the time. So Abraham threw a big party to celebrate. Everyone was happy, or almost everyone. Ishmael, who was already a teenager, wasn't too happy with all the attention on Isaac. He ended up making fun of Isaac during the party. Have you ever seen a child tease another child? Well, that's pretty much what happened, but it made Sarah furious. Sarah was so upset with Ishmael's behavior that she went to Abraham and demanded that he send Hagar and Ishmael away. She didn't want Ishmael, the son of a servant girl, to have any chance of sharing the inheritance with Isaac. But in those days, that was a very hard thing to accept. Ishmael wasn't just Hagar's son. He was also Abraham's legitimate son and, in a way, Sarah's, since Hagar was his personal servant. Casting Ishmael out went against the customs of the time, and Abraham was very upset by Sarah's request. But then God entered the story. He spoke to Abraham and reassured him, saying, "Don't worry, Abraham. I will take care of Ishmael and Hagar. I will make Ishmael a great nation." With this promise, Abraham gathered his courage and sent Hagar and Ishmael away, even though his heart was heavy. He gave them some bread and water, and they set out for the desert. However, things quickly got tough. Imagine being in the desert with little water and no idea where to go. When the water ran out, Hagar was desperate. She didn't want to see Ishmael die of thirst, so she put him under a tree and walked away, crying. But do you know what happened? God heard Ishmael and Hagar's cries. God sent an angel to comfort them and show them a well of water. He also renewed the promise that Ishmael would become a strong and prosperous man with many descendants. This gave Hagar and Ishmael the strength they needed to carry on. From then on, Hagar and Ishmael lived in the desert. Ishmael grew up to be a great hunter, known for his skill with a bow and arrow. He also married and had many children, fulfilling God's promise to make him the father of a great nation. This story shows us how God cares for each one of us, even when all seems lost. He never abandons us, just as he did not abandon Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. Ishmael's life after the separation. After all the confusion and the difficult farewell from Abraham, Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, started a new life in the desert. They first settled in Beersheba, but then they went to the desert of Paran, where they lived for many years. Imagine growing up in a place as challenging as the desert, full of heat, sand, and few resources. Even so, Ishmael grew into a strong, courageous, and very skilled young man. Over time, Ishmael distinguished himself as an excellent hunter, especially with a bow and arrow. He was so good at this that he probably became known as someone who could be trusted to protect and provide for his family in the harsh desert environment. This skill was also essential to his survival and the growth of his future offspring. Hagar, always caring for her son, found Ishmael an Egyptian wife. They married and began to raise their own family. Ishmael did not have just one or two children. He fathered 12 sons and 1 daughter. These children grew up to form 12 tribes, which became nomadic, living in mobile camps throughout the southern desert. They traveled from place to place with their tents and livestock, creating a strong, close-knit community. The names of Ishmael's sons are mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 25 verses 13 to 15, and they are remembered as leaders of their tribes. Ishmael, therefore, fulfilled God's promise to become the father of a great nation. Each of these tribes played an important role in the history of the region, leaving a legacy that spanned generations. Although Isaac had been chosen as the heir to God's special covenant with Abraham, Ishmael was not forgotten. He and Abraham's other sons outside of his marriage to Sarah also received material goods from the patriarch. This shows that Abraham, despite the challenges, cared for his entire family. What is most interesting is that, as adults, Ishmael and Isaac seem to have put their disagreements aside. There is no record in the Bible of conflicts between them after they grew up. In fact, they appear together at a very special moment: the burial of their father, Abraham, Genesis 25. This gesture of unity is a beautiful demonstration of respect and honor to the memory of Abraham. Ishmael's story teaches us that even when faced with difficulties and being placed in challenging situations, he prospered and left a significant legacy. It is proof that God keeps his promises and cares for everyone, regardless of the circumstances. Ishmael in the Bible and tradition. Ishmael's story is fascinating and full of meaning, especially because he became an important figure in both the Bible and the religious traditions of other cultures. According to the biblical account, Ishmael lived a long life and died at the age of 137. However, the Bible does not specify where he was buried, leaving this detail open. Muslim tradition, on the other hand, offers a more definite ending, stating that Ishmael was buried in Mecca. This city has become one of the holiest sites in Islam, which reinforces Ishmael's connection as an important ancestor for many Arab peoples and for the Islamic faith. Ishmael in the New Testament. The story of Ishmael is mentioned again in a symbolic way in the New Testament, in Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 4. Here, Paul uses Ishmael and Isaac to illustrate the difference between two types of relationship with God. He presents Ishmael as someone who was born according to the flesh, that is, as a result of a human decision, while Isaac was born according to the Spirit, a direct fruit of God's miraculous promise. Paul uses this comparison to explain how some people at the time were trying to cling to the old laws in order to achieve salvation, instead of accepting the freedom offered by Christ. Ishmael, then, symbolizes the human attempt to solve things in their own way, while Isaac represents trust in God's promise and the power of the Spirit. This allegory helped Christians understand the new covenant in Christ and free themselves from the legalistic practices that tried to control their faith. Ishmael in Islamic tradition. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is a central figure and is considered one of the ancestors of the Prophet Muhammad. He is remembered as someone who not only received God's protection in the desert, but also played a key role in the construction of the Kaaba, the holiest site in Islam, located in Mecca. According to tradition, Ishmael and his father Abraham worked together to build the Kaaba as a place of worship to the one God, Allah. In addition, the story of Ishmael is seen by Muslims as an example of submission and obedience to God. In the Quran, there is a narrative in which Ishmael is associated with the sacrifice that Abraham almost made. Unlike the Bible, where the sacrifice is attributed to Isaac, Islamic tradition claims that it was Ishmael who was about to be offered to God. This difference highlights Ishmael's importance in the Islamic faith and reinforces his connection to the Arab tradition. Ishmael's legacy. Ishmael's descendants are one of the most impressive parts of his story. He had 12 sons, who became tribal leaders, forming what we know as the Ishmaelites. These nomadic tribes spread across the desert and played important roles in the history of the region. They lived in mobile camps, raised livestock, and excelled as traders and hunters. The Bible mentions the names of Ishmael's sons in Genesis 25 verses 13 to 15, and many of these names appear in other historical and biblical contexts as influential families. Ishmael's relationship with Isaac, his half-brother, is also significant. Despite the conflicts between their mothers, Hagar and Sarah, the two seem to have found a way to coexist peacefully. This is evidenced by the moment when Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury their father, Abraham, Genesis 25. This act of respect and unity shows that even in the midst of differences and hardships, family ties can be restored. Spiritual lessons from Ishmael. The story of Ishmael teaches us many valuable lessons. He faced challenges from the beginning, being driven from his home, growing up in the desert, and having to survive in difficult conditions. Yet, God never abandoned him. God heard his cry and that of his mother in the desert, promising them a prosperous future. This reminds us that even when we feel left out or forgotten, God has a plan for our lives. Ishmael is also an example of how God can use anyone to fulfill his purposes. Although he was not the heir to God's primary covenant with Abraham, he was still blessed with a large offspring and left a lasting impact on history. His life shows us that everyone has an important role in God's plan, even if that role is different than we expect. Ishmael and cultural traditions. Today, Ishmael is remembered in different religious traditions as a patriarch and a symbol of perseverance. In Judeo-Christian culture, he represents the human side of the story of Abraham, showing how human decisions can have consequences, but also how God's grace covers all aspects of life. In Islam, he is celebrated as a prophet and an example of obedience to God. Whether in the Bible, the Quran, or in the history of cultural traditions, Ishmael is a figure who transcends borders, reminding us of the power of faith, resilience, and divine grace. His life is proof that God cares for everyone, even those who are not in the spotlight of the narrative. Other people with the name Ishmael. Did you know that the name Ishmael appears several times in the Bible, and it does not refer only to Abraham's famous son? That's right. In addition to him, other important people also bore this name, each with a unique and interesting story. Let's get to know some of them. 1. Ishmael, descendant of King Saul and Prince Jonathan. This Ishmael was part of the royal family of Israel. He was a descendant of King Saul and his son Jonathan. Although we do not know many details about his life, the mere fact that he is connected to the royal line shows that he played an important role in the history of Israel. His presence reminds us of how the name Ishmael was used in families with great influence at the time. 2. Ishmael, a high-ranking official during the reign of King Jehoshaphat. Another Ishmael mentioned in the Bible was a high-ranking official during the reign of King Jehoshaphat, one of the most righteous kings of Judah. Jehoshaphat is remembered for trying to bring the people closer to God, strengthening the worship of the Lord, and bringing spiritual reforms to the nation. This Ishmael probably helped to administer the kingdom and performed important functions in the government. Imagine being a trusted and close person to such a notable king. 3. Ishmael, the priest in the time of Ezra. Now let's talk about an Ishmael who was a priest. He lived during the time of Ezra, when the people of Israel were returning from exile in Babylon. Ezra was a spiritual leader who helped restore the worship of God in Jerusalem, and this Ishmael, as a priest, played a key role in that process. Priests were responsible for teaching God's laws, leading worship in the temple, and helping the people reconnect with their faith. Isn't it amazing to think of the impact he must have had on so many people's lives? 4. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah. Finally, we have an Ishmael whose story is darker and more dramatic. This Ishmael was the son of Nethaniah and was part of the royal house of David, meaning he was also of royal blood. But his story is tied to a turbulent time. During the Babylonian oppression of Judah, Ishmael committed a shocking act. He killed Gedaliah, the governor of Judah appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. This murder is recorded in 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 40-41. This Ishmael was involved in a political plot full of betrayals and conflicts, showing how the period of exile was a time of great tension. The meaning of the name and legacy. The name Ishmael, which means God hears, was not only a beautiful name, but it also carried a powerful message. All of these people who bore the name Ishmael lived at important times in Israel's history, and even in different contexts, they remind us of how biblical history is full of characters and lessons. Each Ishmael had a different life and mission, but they all show us that the name is not only an identification, but can also be a reminder of the connection with God and the purpose in history. So, whenever we hear about someone named Ishmael, we can remember this message. God hears, cares, and acts in our lives, no matter what moment in history we are in. The meaning of the name Ishmael and its legacy. Have you ever stopped to think about how the meaning of a name can tell an entire story? The name Ishmael is a great example of this. It means God hears, and it's not just a pretty name, but a message full of power and hope. It reminds us that God is always attentive, listening to our prayers and our moments of affliction, even when it seems like no one else is listening. In the Bible, people named Ishmael lived in very different times and faced unique challenges. Some were leaders, others priests, and even protagonists of remarkable episodes. Even with such varied stories, they all have something in common. They left an impact on the history of Israel. This shows that a name is not just a word we use to call someone. It can carry a deep meaning and even reflect the person's connection with God. And do you know what's most incredible? The name Ishmael teaches us that God is always present, even in difficult times. Remember, the mother of the first Ishmael, Hagar, was in the desert, desperate, thinking that all was lost. But God heard her cry and that of her son and showed that he would not abandon them. This name is a reminder that, no matter where we are or what we are going through, God is attentive and willing to help us. Each Ishmael that appears in the Bible had a different life and mission, but they all show that the name is more than an identification. It is like a constant reminder of God's care and presence. So, the next time you hear someone named Ishmael, remember this powerful message. God listens, cares, and acts in our lives, even when we least expect it. This is a lesson that does not change, whether in the past, present, or future. After all, the stories of the Ishmaels in the Bible are like small pieces of a big puzzle that teach us about faith, purpose, and the immense love of God. And this message is something that we can all take to heart, isn't it?